Okay, hello everybody. How you doing? Thank you so much for letting me present this virtually. I'm going to talk today about wetlands in film and the Everglades in film really quickly. A little bit about me. This is my personal website. You can check me out here. That's what I had more hair. Once upon a time. This is a list of my research and publications. So I've researched a lot on the Everglades. I wrote a book that came out last year on the park, and I've written on cultural history in the Everglades. I wrote an article on comic books, and I've also done some work on children's literature set in the Everglades, and now I'm working on this project with film. This is a very large project, and I am just one person in a team of 4 people. And what we did was we actually watched 166 films released between 1980 and 2019. You can see the breakdown of where they're from there. And the goal here was to create a large data set. We had a rubric we used, and we basically tried to, evaluate these films on a variety of criteria. I was actually brought in sort of after the list of films was created. I think they got those films sort of scraping Wikipedia metadata for mentions of wetlands. I don't know exactly how they did it. But Jack Zinnin is leading the project. All the charts and graphs here are his, and then there's 2 other guys, Jeffrey and Brian. They're all scientists at the University of Illinois, and they all do wetlands. And so they sort of asked me to join, and I said, that sounds awesome. This is right up my alley. This is some of the literature that already exists. There's a lot of literary criticism looking mostly at fiction and popular fiction and literature. And then there's also the historians who have also looked at literature a little bit, but also looking at politics. And I don't really know of any work that looks specifically at film and wetlands. And if you know about it, let me know. In general, if you want to summarize all that stuff, all those books, wetlands are perceived very negatively throughout U.S. history. Mostly what we do to wetlands is we drain them. That starts to change in the 1930s as attitudes towards nature start to change. The 30s is a really important decade for changing attitudes towards nature. And then you really see those changes on a much larger scale in the 1970s with the advent of modern environmentalism. You can see that dynamic in reading fiction, in reading literature. But what you also see when you read the literature is that wetlands remain convenient settings for certain types of stories. And, criminal activity is very suited to take place in a wetland in a narrative. Chase scenes you see a lot in wetlands. You see a lot of magic and supernatural types of stories in wetlands. A lot of horror films and monster films. A lot of bad horror films. You see often wetlands as a refuge, and then you also see this trope as the wetland is an obstacle, people sinking into the wetlands. So even though our attitudes towards wetlands change, in a lot of ways the type of stories we tell in wetlands don't change. We still tell the same type of stories, and I think because of that, it sort of runs up against this idea that do we really view wetlands differently if we're telling the same types of stories in them, and the monsters are still all in the wetlands? So it's kind of a problem. Why are wetlands perceived this way? This is stuff that I've really written on extensively, and I always like to say, it sounds very stupid, but it's very not. It's very deep. Wetlands are wet. I mean, it's kind of dumb, but wetlands are wet. And if you think about that, it's actually a really meaningful statement because humans, we are a terrestrial species that evolved on the savanna. We do not live in the water. We do not live on the water. Our cities are not wet. Our civilization lives on dry lands, and wetlands are a problem for humans. Wetlands are not easily domesticated or controlled. The way we control wetlands typically is by draining them. And wetlands are very hostile to humans. Going into the wetland, I live on the coast of Georgia surrounded by marsh. No one really goes in there unless they're on a boat. And you see this historically as well in the way that that wetlands have been refuges for maroon communities and Native Americans. Wetlands have often been a place where other people go to escape from the dominant civilization, the dominant society, law enforcement, whoever it is. And that's because of these other factors. Okay, so let's get into the big picture data. So this is data that applies to the whole data set, the 166 films that were released from 1980 to 2019. And what we found is that in 53% of them, wetlands are viewed negatively. Only 14% of them, wetlands are viewed unqualified positive way. 19% is complex, 14% is neutral. This is after the advent of modern environmentalism, and yet these very negative portrayals of wetlands persist. Perhaps because it fits into these types of stories, but perhaps because we don't really care about wetlands. Maybe that's just a minority view. Maybe it's just these environmentalists that care about these things. More big picture data, the type of wetlands that are in the films, and then on the right is the type of people that are being encountered in the wetlands. So antagonists are very often encountered in a wetland. Heroes sometimes, allies, magical creatures, ghosts. You see the mentor oracle a lot as well. Another thing we looked at is what is the wetland doing in terms of the plot? What is the role it's playing in the plot? So the biggest one here is wetland is an obstacle. You also see wetlands as places where there is a fight between the protagonist and the antagonist. You see chase scenes. You see the quagmire, the emotional lair, the emotional low point, the crime scene, the lair of the antagonist. But you do see also the home of the protagonist, the refuge. So maybe slightly more positive stuff at the bottom, but the stuff at the top, pretty negative, I think, in some ways. The wetland is an obstacle. And then there's also themes. So we have plot devices, and then the thematic role that the wetland is playing. And 56% of the time, it's related to death, which is really interesting. 33% of the time, it's a refuge. It's a thematic refuge. 25% of the time, there's a sort of ostracism, outcast. There's a bunch of themes sort of in the 20s that I think are all related to maybe the hero's journey or self-actualization. Environmentalism or conservation is only a theme 11% of the time, so very rarely is that a theme in a film, and maybe that makes sense. Maybe it's because films are about conflict. We love violent films in America, and so maybe just death is just part of the way films are, but I don't know. Maybe there's more to this. So then we get to the films set in the Everglades, and this is what I'm sort of more interested in for just to think about this for this project. There's 13 films set in the Everglades, and I'm going to talk about some of these individually and also talk about all of them collectively. So collectively, the Everglades is portrayed negatively in 7 films. It's portrayed bimodal, negative to positive in 3, and then positive to negative in 2. And then in one film, it's what we labeled dynamically complex, or it's just too complicated. 0 films is the Everglades portrayed in an unqualified positive way. This is really interesting to me because, I think the Everglades, out of every wetland in America, or maybe even in the world, the Everglades is probably one of the most famous and one of the most celebrated. And yet you don't get a single film where it's just unqualified positive portrayal of the Everglades. And in fact, negative is by far the biggest element here, more than half. Is that more than half? 7? Yeah. Another thing we looked at here is so the negative positive axis, but also is it being portrayed in an ecologically realistic way or not? And so out of these 13 films, 7 of them, it is being portrayed in a rich and ecologically realistic way. 6 of them, it's just generic flat. You see that a lot. You just see the generic swamp plants. You do see a lot of fantastic supernatural depictions as well. There's none here. That might be just because we're talking about a real place. But I think there's other things going on too that I don't think I have time to talk about. And then themes in the Everglades, again, death is the big one. Just like we saw in the bigger data set, justice and revenge is a big one. You have this self-actualization, sort of Joseph Campbell stuff, which is 3. And then environmental conservation is 0. None of these films have that as a theme. You maybe could include adaptation here, but I don't think so. If you've seen that, it's a really interesting film, kind of weird film, but it's sort of tangential, I think, to that film. What is the role that the Everglades is playing in the narrative? In 4 of these films, it's the lair of the villain or the crime scene associated with the villain. On the flip side, in 2 of these films, it is the home or the destination of the protagonist. And then the second set of things here, the location of the film's climax, location of an object desired by a protagonist, and then you have obstacle and refuge. The film's climax is actually pretty common. There's a lot of movies we watched where there's no wetland until the climax, or just 1 or 2 little things, and then the climax is in a wetland. It's a dramatic place, I think. It's a dramatic landscape where you can have a climax, and I think in a way, in a wetland, it's a type of environment where nature has more of a sense of, I don't want to say agency, but it's more of an actor than just the setting. And then there's also in our rubric, there's an other where you can type other things. And in two of these movies, they did not, the person that watched it did not indicate that it was a crime scene, but did indicate that it was a place where people hid dead bodies, um, which is really interesting because, I mean, you can sort of lump that in with this in a way. And so 6 out of these 13 films are like crime related in a way. You know, you have like a lair of a criminal or a crime scene or a place where you're dumping a dead body. So Pain or Gain is one of the ones that I watched, which the Everglades is barely in it, but they go there to dump a dead body. They kill someone and they have to dump the dead body. They don't commit the crime in the Everglades, but they are going to the Everglades to dispose of this, which is interesting and probably is something that happens. Let's look at a couple of these films really quickly. Adaptation is a great film. So this is something you very commonly see in these films. Someone, neck deep or waist deep in the water. Which I've never done that. I don't want to do that. That's not something that people tend to do, but you see it in these films, and this guy's not sinking, but the sinking is something you see a lot. And then this is a chase scene. There's a chase scene. Someone's trying to kill him, and there's a chase in the swamp. Bad Boys 2 is another really interesting one. This is a scene where two things are happening in the wetland. There's a drug deal, which I think is pretty, definitely happened. 1980s cocaine smugglers in Miami were using the Everglades. And then you also have a KKK meeting. So the KKK doesn't want to they want to meet in secret. They want to meet somewhere where no one's going to go. The drug dealers want to do their drug deal in secret. They want to be somewhere where no one's going to go. The Everglades is the obvious place here because who's going to go into the Everglades, right? It's too wet. You can't get in there. You can't get out. Another film in the Everglades, Invasion USA. This is a Chuck Norris action film where a bunch of Latin American terrorists are invading America, sort of like Red Dawn, and he stops them. This is him wrestling an alligator. This is him driving an airboat. He lives in the Everglades. So this is one of the ones where he is the protagonist and he lives in the Everglades. But it really is the whole action is taking place in the Everglades. It's a good place. It's an interesting place to set a fight scene, to set that. Because there's a lot going on in the environment. And then Wild Things is another one. So this is a movie that barely takes place in the Everglades. This is a 90s teenage sex crime movie. It was a very big movie when it came out. I think it's been forgotten, which maybe is a good thing. But barely. And this is a film where they dump dead bodies in the Everglades. But you can see they sort of chose for their title scene to have the Everglades. There's a visual allure here that they want to connect to the film, even though almost none of the film actually is in the wetland, other than maybe, I think there's 3 scenes, and one of them they're dumping dead bodies. And then Gone Fishing is the last one I'll mention really quickly. It's Joe Pesci over there. And, I'm blanking on his name. He was in all the Lethal Weapon films. And Willie Nelson is in this film as well. And these guys go on a fishing trip into the Everglades, but they encounter a murderer in the Everglades. Because, of course, that's where the murderer goes to escape. He goes to the Everglades and they have to catch him. Willie Nelson plays a sort of mentor, sage kind of figure in this film. Sort of like Yoda in the Dagobah Swamp in Star Wars. There's another film in this set that's set in the Everglades where that same character is played by, is represented as a Seminole Indian. So I think that's another thing you will see sometimes in some of these films. So conclusions, despite the advent of modern environmentalism, wetlands are really not viewed or depicted positively in film. This I think there's perhaps because wetlands are a very useful setting for plot devices. Wetlands, we still see them as these mysterious and magical places. We still see them as dangerous and foreboding. They're hard to get into and out of. They're wet. I mean, how positively do we really see wetlands like the Everglades? I think sometimes we see them positively in the abstract, but we don't really go spend a lot of time in these places because they are very hostile. The other point I want to make is that wetlands are very visually compelling and orally compelling. There's a lot visually going on in a wetland that you can use in a film, and there's a lot of auditory cues in a wetland. Another thing we did in our rubric was track the sounds that were going on in a wetland. And there is a whole sort of wetland auditory vocabulary of these films of water gurgling and splashing and mud bubbling and frogs and birds. So really kind of interesting. And then finally, do the Everglades stick out? Are they different? Not really in terms of themes, but the thing that I'm really struck with here is that there are no horror movies or monster movies set in the Everglades. And you might say, well, that's because it's a real place. But if you contrast that to the Louisiana bayous, there's tons of horror movies and supernatural, sort of like voodoo zombie monster movies. I saw two movies that were monster fish in the Louisiana bayous. So there's tons of those in the bayous, but none of them in the Everglades. And in contrast, about half the Everglades film involved crime. And maybe you want to blame that on Miami, which you probably could. I lived in Miami for a very long time. That's where I'm from. But there is a historical reality of criminality in the Everglades. So Ed Watson, famously in the Everglades, the Ashley Gang was a gang of bank robbers in the 20s that hit out in the Everglades. The 1980s cocaine smuggling. So I think when what these films are really showing here is sort of the ways we actually think about the Everglades. I mean, I might think about the Everglades in this sort of biological, ecological, conception, but I think the common person might actually think about it from a very different perspective involving sort of crime and criminality and the closeness to Miami and a place to dump dead bodies and, a place where drug deals are happening. So really interesting. And the bayous, of course, have a different cultural component. So I think this really speaks to the way we think of different wetlands. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know. You can email me. There's my email address. And thank you very much.